Hello, this is Bobby Grow. Welcome to the Always Reforming podcast. It's been a while, but I thought I would do another one. And hopefully what I'm going to try to do is get this hooked up to iTunes. There is a way to do that with the platform or the host I'm using, Spreaker. So it's very low production here. I'm just using my iPhone. And I'm sure you can probably tell that. Hopefully the quality is good enough, though, that it's not distracting to the point that you don't want to listen. If you don't want to listen, just blame me. My abilities to communicate, articulate various points that I talk about. But anyway, look for that in the future if you listen to these podcasts, and I'm going to try to start to do them more frequently than I do. It will just be random times when I have time available, but if you follow me on Twitter or friends with me on Facebook or read my blog, I have a page there with links to all my podcasts as well. Then you should be alerted that way. And I guess once I put it on iTunes, you should get, if you subscribe to my podcast that way, you'll get an alert there, or you can go straight to Spreaker and my podcast there, Always Reforming Podcast, and subscribe to me via Spreaker directly. So there are various outlets for you to become aware of new podcasts and forthcoming podcasts as I announce those on my podcast. So anyway, I just wanted to mention that before we get started here with this episode. I don't really count my episodes per se. I'm not even sure. I think this is like my 22nd episode now. So over the last year and a year and a half, I think, since I've been doing this. That's not enough, really. So like I said, I'll increase my output with these podcasts. But this one's going to be kind of like a miscellaneous. I do blog posts that I entitle that as well. But I wanted to respond a little bit to something that kind of irked me a little bit earlier today on Twitter, which that's probably common fare for most of us. I think it's easy to come across things where we can either directly or indirectly become irked by something we read and would like to outlet that, express some of that. So that's what this is going to be. So it's going to kind of negative, really, unfortunately. But hopefully I can make it less negative in the way that I kind of just vent about the kind of pushback I received from a prominent, I guess you would say more high profile personage in or on Twitter and on social media in general. And I've known him for I've electronically known him for quite a few years now, starting with Facebook and then his blog. And I wasn't even on Twitter for a long time. And then on Twitter, that's where he really, really posts a lot. But anyway, I had a little interaction with him. I'm not quite sure I want to name him. If he were to listen to this, he would know exactly who it is, who I'm referring to. He'd know I'm referring to him. But it's not just him. He's kind of like represents or typifies a kind of pushback I've received from others within his tradition, which he's in what I always call classical Calvinist tradition, post-Reformed Orthodox tendencies. Not just tendencies, that's where he would identify himself as theologically, traditionally. So that's of course there's already going to be kind of like a natural kind of conflict, I guess, there, just based purely upon material theological reasons, because of my own position, where I come from, and the approach that I take. And this leads us into really the pushback that he gave me. I'm not going to get into what caused the interaction, like the original tweet. And I might. No, I'm not going to do that. I was thinking about maybe getting into that, but I'm not going to get into that. It just had something to do with something that Ligon Duncan posted about some of his rules that he follows, some of his guidelines that he follows, the boundaries that he sets for himself when he interacts on social media, if and when he does. And so it caused me. I don't agree. I didn't agree with what he was saying. I thought it comes off sounding pretty patronizing and elitist. And so that's what I said. But that kind of got the ball rolling, and the interaction started that way. And so that's what I want to respond to now, was basically the pushback, and this is common, was that Bobby, like, this is my paraphrase, in quotes, Bobby, bro, all you're worried about, all you think about constantly is you're constantly critiquing the guild, like Theological Guild. You're constantly critiquing evangelicalism, conservative evangelicalism, and you're constantly critiquing Westminster Calvinism. That's all you do. And he, end quote, and that's, he was using that kind of really an ad hominem sort of a way to discount my critique of one of the rules that Ligon Duncan uses, the patronizing rule that I think he uses to boundary set as far as his engagement on social media. And so I thought that was presumptuous on my interlocutor's part. And so this is what I want to clarify and talk about a little bit is yes, it's not untrue that those things, I've been critical of those things online off and on for years, even before my interlocutor was out of high school. I mean, yeah, I've been doing this for a long time now online, and it is kind of like part of my mode is to critique aspects of the evangelical subculture, the definitely classical Calvinist approach, federal theology, covenantal theology, classical theism, as it's just simply repristinated and received by by guys today in the conservative evangelical reformed world, by theologians today in that world. And so, yeah, I've been critical of that for a long time from various vantage points as well. I've also been critical of the guild, the theology guild. Ironically, I'm trying to get into it as well, and I live on the fringes of it even now. And so it's like to me, to be critical of the guild, so to speak, it's not like I'm like a total outsider to the guild. It's not like I'm not implicated by the things that I'm saying about the guild either. I am, to a degree, insofar as I'm related to it and live in it and from it in my own way. So it's not as if same with evangelicalism. It's not as if I'm an outsider being critical of conservative evangelicalism, or it's not like I'm an outsider of Reformed theology, because I am Reformed, because I am an evangelical, because I do live and move in the atmosphere of the guild, the theological guild. So none of the critiques that I have of any of these things are simply abstract for me. They're self-critical. And so I think that needs to be appreciated to start off with. Secondly, I'm greater than those critiques, not less than. Meaning, those aren't completely definitive of all that I do online, theologically. If you read my blog, which my interlocutor obviously doesn't read everything I write on my blog, because I post constantly, as my readers know. almost daily at points, off and on now. I mean, I used to post daily, and I post probably 4 times a week at this point. So on average, I would say. So yeah, I post a lot, and if you read me all the time, you know that I'm not just being critical of evangelicalism or Westminster Calvinism or the Guild. In fact, I rarely critique the Guild. I've only done actually a few posts on that over the last 14 years that I've been blogging, so that one's pretty unfounded. And then if I do critique evangelicalism, it's the subculture, and it's not out of line. I usually critique the so-called moralistic therapeutic deism, as it's been noted by Christian Smith, and Todd Billings has picked up on that, and others. I mean, that's not very risque. That's not very abnormal, and it's not something that I constantly am doing. The one most prominent issue that I'm confronting, and this is and the way that I confront things in this realm is not like broad brush stroke critiques. I'm not making cultural critiques. I'm actually engaging with theology on my blog posts when I make critiques of Westminster Calvinism. And I'm not just doing it on my blog. I've done it with my 2 co-edited books with Mike Habitz. So it's pretty substantial. And in fact, I'm working on getting a PhD going within the next year. I actually have something really promising, I think, that's finally unfolding in that area. And it's going to go even further in that direction. As far as evangelical Calvinism, it's going to be on evangelical Calvinism and developing that further and getting into theological exegesis and the Reformed tradition and evangelical Calvinism's place within that tradition as an iteration within the broader development of Reformed theology since its inception, since the beginning. So it's not as if these things are abstract, and it's not. And this is the area, that I think you could most prominently identify me with over the years through my blog writing. I have been critical of Westminster theology, and yet even that has kind of fallen off over the last few years in my blogging. My blog posts have been less critical in that direction. Every now and then I'll spike posts that way. Just recently, the Gospel Coalition, just a couple weeks ago or less, had their annual conference, so I reposted like 3 or 4 posts contra the theology of the Gospel Coalition, which is grounded in the Westminster tradition of Calvinism and federal theology in a broad way. So, yeah, if one of those critiques or pushbacks towards me by my interlocutor would stick, it is that one. But even that, if you read my blog posts, doesn't really do justice to my own approach, my own identity, theologically, and what I'm writing about at my blog. And it's just a blog, but yeah, it's significant for me. That's where I outlet a lot of my stuff and my thoughts as I'm reading. As you know, if you read my blog posts, you know that that's what I do. It helps me to slow down and just think through what I'm reading. And that's how I use my blog. And I think that's a great way to use a blog, and then to be able to share that with others and get your feedback if you want to give it. And so that's what I do. Usually the posts that I do nowadays have to do with Bart's theology and Torrance's theology still, and whatever I'm reading at the time, though, I'll usually post something about it. And that's really where I'm at. Yeah, I always will have. I'm definitely committed to being critical of classical Calvinism. I can't help it if my interlocutor doesn't like that. I don't care. That doesn't really make any difference to me whether he likes that or not. He doesn't like my theology, per se. So I don't care. That's fine. We disagree. But I don't really like being pigeonholed at the same time. and having my whole identity, Christian identity, reduced to that, because it's not. It's greater than that. I'm actually a person with feelings, and cue the violin. But I am greater than my parts, and so that's really all I want to say, is that there's more going on here, and I know, and I need to be more charitable that way myself. That I do recognize that there's more going on with even my interlocutor, even with him and his commitments to his own theological tradition. I can recognize that he's greater than that himself. That, yeah, that's a significant part of what motivates him and drives him in his reading of the Bible, his reading of culture, his reading of the church. It's very significant. All of our various respective interpretive traditions are significant. They determine our conclusions, and they determine many of our decisions, our daily decisions in our daily lives. So it's not insignificant. But at the same time, we're people, we're complex, and I think that was kind of what really kind of irked me about that response to me. And he kind of used that to kind of bludgeon me a little bit. He didn't keep pressing it too much as I responded back to him, but he used it in that way to attempt to marginalize my critique of Ligon Duncan's rules of engagement for social media. And so it was pretty kind of ad hominem, actually. And so that's really all I'm registering in this podcast, is kind of not getting into the nitty-gritty of some theological point per se. It has more to do with just interpersonal dynamics on social media, theological online interaction. And that's an important piece to me. I mean, obviously, I spend a lot of time in engagement online and social media theologically, because that's really all I have, and that's a lot, and that's true for all of us, I think, or a lot of us, that we are able to just get our ideas out there and have some interaction around those ideas, and I think that's fine. And just because certain motifs or themes stand out for us, it doesn't mean that we can be reduced to those either. And so I think that's an important point that I just want to make in this podcast. That's really the primary point I want to make in this podcast, is that we are all greater than our what seems to stand out for us in our identities online theologically. That there's more going on behind the scenes. We're more complex than those avatar type online identities reflect. Sure, there's truth to saying, okay, well, yeah, Bobby, you post on these issues a lot, so they must be important to you. Yeah, that's true. But that doesn't mean that that's the whole truth about who I am. And so that's what I really just wanted to say, is that, and I think that's true for all of us in regard to our online theological identities. And it's something I need to be sensitive to as well. When I'm interacting with others, even my interlocutor, I recognize that there's more going on there with him too. And I shouldn't reduce him fully to the Westminster Confession of Faith, even though he likes it a lot. So I just think, though, that we are a complex as human beings. We are dynamic, and I think that's important to bear in mind as we interact with each other online in a theological world, in particular as Christians, that we can be charitable towards each other that way, even if the medium itself doesn't help foster that kind of sense. It's hard to pick up body language. It's hard to pick up just the way that we're articulating it. It comes off terse when maybe it's not really terse, Even if you use an emoji, those can help. But again, they don't help. They don't capture exactly the whole dynamic, the whole complexity that a person is in themselves in real life. And so only certain aspects can be captured by our interaction theologically online, and not the whole reality is always reflected there. So again, I just want to say that we are all greater than our avatar-like theological identities on Twitter, Facebook, and whatever other social media platform we use to express ourselves. And while I find online interaction, it can be fruitful, it has been for me more than not over the years. I have made lots of connections with people that I never would have. I've developed theologically in ways I never would have without being online, without blogging in particular. And so I appreciate, even with all of its pitfalls in place, and that's what I'm talking about here in this podcast. There are pitfalls, which we all are aware of at some level, vis-a-vis social media interaction. It's flat. It's not round interaction. And so we just need to be aware of that. I need to be aware of that. And I don't want to pigeonhole people solely based upon their online identities, even though that's all we often have to go on in regard to the way that we think about the various people we are interacting with, interfacing with online. That's all that we pretty much know about them. But I need to remember that we are a complex as human beings. And as Christians, we are ultimately brothers and sisters in Christ, no matter what our interpretive traditions are. And that's always been something that I have always been committed to that. And I think people might not recognize that with me, is the idea that I seem to be maybe sectarian or something. That if you're not an evangelical Calvinist, in quotes, as we define that, or if you're not a Bartian, or if you're not a Torrensian, or if you're not a Calvinian in a certain way, or if you don't fit this or that label, that I am so critical of you that I think you might not even be a brother or a sister in Christ. Well, I don't think that way, actually. I've never thought that way about anybody, even as critical as I am of the Westminster Calvinist tradition, as I call it. I've never thought of them, those people who are proponents of that sort of interpretive tradition. I've never thought of them as non-brothers or non-sisters in Christ. And so I think that needs to be made clear as well, is that I'm not really ultimately operating with a sectarian attitude. Now, I do like to have some fun on Twitter. I'm not sure. I do have a sense of humor. It's very dry. And I don't really think people don't understand that necessarily about me. That's one thing that definitely doesn't come through very well online. And so I do like to mess around. I like to joust with people. That doesn't bother me. But people seem to get offended really quickly. And I don't even mind if I get offended. I still like to keep it going at a certain point. At a certain point, yeah, it's not worth it. But I think people back in the day, blogging, we used to really go for it. And yet we could stay friends loosely. But to me, it seems like as blogs have gone sort of to the wayside, and Twitter and Facebook theologically have replaced that, it also seems there's been correlation with that, or as corollary with that. It seems like there's been a thinner skin developed, and that people, anytime there's any kind of jousting that people want to engage in, that I want to engage in with somebody, all of a sudden I'm labeled a troll because I'm wanting to debate you or challenge you, or I might say something witty and quick just to start something, maybe to start a little debate. And then it turns quickly into, oh, you're a troll. Don't feed the trolls, And so, again, I guess a lot of this podcast is just about online etiquette in the theological world. And how engagement happens. And I think that, again, we are a complex people, and we are responsible for what we say and do, even online, before God, coram Deo. And I'm not unaware of that, too. I'm sensitive to that. I'm also realistic to recognize that, yeah, we're all going to mess up. We're all going to get into the so-called flesh. And we need to be sensitive to that online. But even with all that, those dangers in place, I still think online interaction is worthwhile. And again, I think we need to be cognizant of the fact that we are greater than our social media parts. And so we shouldn't reduce each other down to various positions and then read motives into those. And that's really, I think, what happened today between me and my interlocutor. So anyway, this is kind of a random podcast, and I'm not even sure it came out very well here, but I wanted to say something. I haven't done one of these for a while, so like I said, I'm going to try to hook my, in closing here, I'm going to try to hook my Spreaker podcast, my Always Reforming podcast, up to iTunes at some point here in the future. And hopefully that will make it more accessible to more people. And hopefully I can spend more time on this and offer better content than I think, actually, if you look back at the podcasts I have, and I think there is some good content in there, but I want to be a little bit more polished in the way that I present it. Even this podcast has been pretty choppy. It's just off the top. I'm sitting here talking into my phone all by myself here in the bedroom. So it's kind of, it'd be easier if I had at least one other person with me to talk with. But so it is what it is. But in the future, I hope to maybe I'll start writing out my podcasts, which we kind of lose like the organicism that I think make podcasts good, like the dialogical, conversational nature to a good podcast is that it's just kind of conversational, and that's what I kind of like about podcasts too. So I'm afraid if I do that, then it might sound more contrived and be less appealing that way. But there's got to be some balance there too. I need some notes or something maybe to follow instead of just doing stream of consciousness here like I'm doing right now. So we'll see how things go. It's not like this podcast is is bringing salvation to the whole world or something. It's not that significant, but I still want it to be, if I'm going to spend my time doing it, I want it to be valuable and worthwhile, not just for you, but for me too. So we'll see how it goes. And I'm thankful that if you've listened to this, I'm thankful you did, and hopefully you found something worthwhile in what I just communicated. All right, till next time. This is Bobby Grow.